Daniel was a man who lived his life measured in torque, horsepower, and the smell of high-octane fuel. As a seasoned restoration expert, he had spent 2 decades breathing life back into rust buckets that other mechanics had left to rot in fields. He knew the difference between surface oxidation and structural cancer, and he knew a bad deal when he saw one, or at least he thought he did. His latest acquisition was supposed to be the crown jewel of his career, a retirement fund on wheels. It was a 1970 Plymouth Hemi-Cuda, a car so legendary and rare that finding one in pristine condition for the listed price felt like winning the lottery. The seller, a man known only as Slick Rick on the vintage forums, had provided high-definition photos, video walkarounds, and a compelling story about a grandfather who had kept the car climate-controlled since the Nixon administration. Daniel, usually cautious, had let his excitement override his instincts. He wired the money, a substantial portion of his savings, and waited for the transport truck to arrive. When the trailer finally pulled up to his workshop, the Cuda looked magnificent in the afternoon sun. The Tor red paint gleamed, the chrome bumpers acted like mirrors, and the stance was aggressive and perfect. The driver handed over the keys, and Daniel felt a surge of triumph. He signed the delivery papers, and the truck drove off, leaving him alone with his prize. For the first hour, he just admired it. But as the sun began to set and the workshop lights flickered on, the first cracks in the illusion began to appear. He ran his hand along the rear quarter panel, a habit he had developed over years of bodywork. His fingers, sensitive to even the slightest imperfection, caught on a microscopic ripple. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but he could feel it. A wave of unease settled in his stomach. He pressed harder. The steel didn't feel right. It had a strange, dull resilience, lacking the crisp, cold solidity of factory sheet metal. He grabbed a magnet from his workbench, a standard test for detecting body filler, often used to hide dents or rust. He placed the magnet on the fender. It slid off. He tried the door. It barely held. He tried the roof. Nothing. Panic began to rise in his throat. A car this clean shouldn't have this much Bondo unless it had been rolled down a cliff and rebuilt with plaster. He rushed to the trunk, popping the lid to inspect the shock towers and the floor pan. The paint inside was thick, almost rubbery. He took a small pick tool and pressed it into the corner of the trunk floor. The tool sank in deep, puncturing a layer of soft material that had been painted over to look like steel. It wasn't metal. It was fiberglass mesh and industrial filler. The pristine car was a sculpture made of lies. Hey guys, we are taking a quick pit stop here because we need your help to solve this mystery. We are incredibly close to hitting 10 Sauerland subscribers, and we need you to smash that subscribe button right now to help us cross the finish line. It helps the channel massively. Also, if you're enjoying the story, consider using the Super Thanks button to support our work directly, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing our global crew in the comments. Now, let's get back to the garage. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He had bought a lemon. The seller had likely taken a rusted-out Hulk, slapped gallons of filler on it, sprayed it with a cheap but shiny paint job, and sold it before the chemical reaction caused the whole thing to bubble. Furious, he grabbed his phone to call the seller, but the number was already disconnected. The forum profile had been deleted. He was alone with a worthless pile of junk. He sat on the shop floor, head in his hands, looking at the gleaming red fraud. The only way to recoup even a fraction of his money was to strip it down, sell whatever genuine parts were salvageable, the engine, the transmission, the interior trim, and scrap the body. It was a devastating loss, but he had to start immediately. He grabbed a heavy-duty orbital sander and a coarse 80-grit disc. He approached the rear quarter panel, the spot where he had felt the ripple. With a grimace, he pressed the sander against the beautiful red paint and pulled the trigger. Red dust clouded the air as the glossy finish was annihilated. Beneath the paint, he found exactly what he expected. A thick, creamy layer of yellow body filler. He ground through that, expecting to find rusted, lace-like steel, or perhaps no steel at all. The sander whined as it dug deeper. Suddenly, the dust changed color. It wasn't the brown of rust, nor the gray of steel. It was a dark, muddy orange. Daniel stopped and wiped the area with a rag. The surface beneath the filler was hideous. It looked like the metal had been ravaged by a severe, aggressive skin disease. It was pitted, rough, and covered in a strange dark brown oxidation that looked like severe rot. "You hid the rust with filler," Daniel muttered to the empty room, his anger flaring again. He decided to grind it down to bare metal to see if there was anything solid left to weld to. He switched to a grinding wheel, a tool that would spark heavily against steel. He pressed the wheel against the rusted metal, but there were no sparks. The grinder shrieked, but instead of a shower of yellow fire, it just kicked up a heavy metallic dust. Daniel pulled back, confused. Steel always sparked. Even rusted steel sparked. He looked closely at the spot he had ground. The rust hadn't flaked off. Instead, the grinding wheel had polished the surface. Where the dark brown rot had been, there was now a strange, dull, brownish gold luster. It didn't look like iron. It didn't look like steel. It looked almost like bronze, but harder. He tapped it with a wrench. Thud. It was a dull, dense sound, completely unlike the ring of a steel body panel. He moved to the front fender and stripped a patch there. Same result. Thick filler hiding this strange, corroded-looking, non-magnetic metal. He checked the roof. Same thing. The entire unibody of the car wasn't made of standard stamped steel. It was constructed from this bizarre, heavy, non-ferrous material that had oxidized to a dark brown, which the seller had mistaken for terminal rust and covered up. Daniel's mind raced. Plymouth didn't build cars out of bronze. They didn't build cars out of copper. He went to the engine bay, looking for the VIN tag. It was there, riveted in place, but it looked odd. The rivets were not the standard factory rosette rivets. They were smooth, older, hand-pressed aviation rivets. He cleaned the VIN tag carefully. The sequence was standard for a 1970 CUDA, except for the last 6 digits. Usually, these numbers indicated the production sequence. But on this tag, the sequence was XOR-EXP. The EXP was stamped slightly crooked, as if done by hand after the plate was made. Daniel froze. EXP usually stood for experimental in manufacturing terms, but those cars were almost always crushed by the factory after testing. They were never sold to the public. And they certainly weren't made of this strange material. He needed to know what he was dealing with. He took a small filing of the metal from the fender and placed it on his workbench. He grabbed a bottle of heavy-duty rust remover which contained phosphoric acid. If this was rust, the acid would dissolve it. He dropped the metal filing into a small glass of the acid. It didn't dissolve. It didn't bubble. It just sat there, defiant. The material was chemically stable. This wasn't decay. This wasn't damage. The rough, pitted texture that the seller had spent thousands of dollars hiding with Bondo wasn't a defect. It was the natural state of whatever exotic alloy this car was made of. Daniel realized he wasn't stripping a scam. He was excavating a mystery that had been buried under Bondo for 50 years. He picked up his phone again, but this time he wasn't calling the seller. He was calling his old mentor, a retired metallurgical engineer who used to work for Chrysler Defense Contracting in the late 60s. He needed to know what kind of metal didn't spark, didn't rust, and was heavy enough to sink a boat. The arrival of Arthur, Daniel's mentor, shifted the energy in the garage from solitary despair to a clinical, scientific investigation. Arthur was a man of few words, a retired materials engineer who had spent the better part of the Cold War developing alloys for deep-sea submersibles and experimental turbine engines. He arrived carrying a heavy, padded Pelican case, his eyes scanning the partially stripped carcass of the CUDA with a mixture of skepticism and professional curiosity. To him, a car body made of non-ferrous metal sounded like a backyard fabrication or a fiberglass kit car gone wrong, but Daniel's insistence on the phone had been frantic enough to warrant the trip. The garage was silent, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the faint settling noises of the cooling metal. Arthur ran his hand over the exposed patch on the fender, his calloused fingertips tracing the strange, pitted topography of the metal that Daniel had mistaken for rust. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket, leaning in until his nose nearly touched the fender, examining the grain structure of the corrosion. He straightened up, his expression unreadable, and opened the Pelican case. Inside lay a handheld X-ray fluorescence, XRF analyzer, a device that looked like a futuristic ray gun designed to identify the elemental composition of any material in seconds. This was not a tool found in standard auto body shops. It was an instrument of high-end metallurgy. Arthur pressed the nose of the device against the exposed brownish-gold metal of the fender and pulled the trigger. The machine emitted a low electronic whine as it bombarded the sample with X-rays, measuring the fluorescent energy emitted back by the electrons. Daniel watched the small LCD screen on the back of the device, holding his breath. The analysis bar loaded slowly, processing a mix of elements that shouldn't exist on a Detroit assembly line. When the results beeped onto the screen, Arthur froze. He reset the machine, calibrated it against a known sample of steel from his toolbox, and tested the car again. The result was identical. He showed the screen to Daniel. The car was not steel. It was not aluminum. The readout showed a complex, high-strength alloy composed primarily of copper, nickel, and a significant percentage of beryllium with trace amounts of cobalt. This was beryllium copper, an incredibly dense, non-sparking, non-magnetic, and phenomenally expensive superalloy typically reserved for aerospace bushings, oil rig tools, and explosive environments where a single spark could mean death. It was a material that cost nearly 50 times more than steel by weight. The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. The entire unibody of the car, every fender, door skin, and floor pan, was cast or stamped from a material used in fighter jets and satellites. The mystery of the rust was instantly solved. Beryllium copper, when left exposed to the air, naturally oxidizes to a dark chocolate brown color. This oxidation wasn't a cancer eating the metal. It was a protective skin, a passivation layer that prevented any further corrosion. The rough, pitted texture wasn't damage from the elements. It was the surface finish of a raw, sand-cast prototype or an experimental hydroformed panel that had never been sanded smooth for painting. The previous owner, the scammer, had looked at this dark, rough, oxidized surface, assumed it was catastrophic rot, and panicked. He had spent thousands of dollars burying a priceless metallurgical anomaly under cheap plastic filler to hide what he thought was a flaw, unknowingly preserving the evidence of a secret industrial experiment. Daniel felt a wave of vertigo. He wasn't looking at a ruined muscle car. He was looking at a multi-million-dollar block of strategic metal shaped like a Plymouth. But the question remained, why? Why would Chrysler, a company known for mass production and cost-cutting, build a single Hemi-Cuda out of a material so expensive and difficult to work with? Arthur began to piece together the historical context, recalling rumors from the chaotic days of 1969 and 1970. It was the height of the muscle car wars, but also a time of intense government contracting. Manufacturers were often trying to cross-pollinate technologies between their defense divisions and their automotive lines. There had been whispers of Project Chimera, a hush-hush initiative to test vibration-dampening materials for the upcoming turbine car program, or perhaps for silent running capabilities in military vehicles. The heavy, dense nature of beryllium copper made it acoustically dead, perfect for a vehicle designed to run silent or to test extreme structural rigidity without adding roll cages. They realized they had to strip the rest of the car immediately. The restoration was no longer about paint and polish. It was an archaeological dig. Daniel and Arthur worked through the night, taking shifts with the grinder and the heat gun. The process was grueling. The Bondo the seller had applied was thick, sometimes up to an inch deep in the valleys of the body lines. As they peeled back the layers of deception, the car began to reveal its true form. It wasn't just the material that was different. The lines of the car were subtly altered. The rear wheel arches were flared slightly wider than a stock Cuda to accommodate the immense weight of the alloy body. The A-pillars were thicker, cast as a single piece with the roof structure rather than welded, indicating a level of manufacturing sophistication that was decades ahead of its time. As they cleared the filler from the driver's side door, they found another anomaly. Standard doors on a 1970 Cuda were relatively light, stamped steel sheets. When Daniel removed the hinges, which were also made of the strange bronze-colored alloy, the door practically fell off, its weight nearly crushing his foot. It weighed 3 times as much as a steel door. They wrestled it onto a padded stand. Inside the door shell, where the window mechanism would usually sit, there was no rust-proofing wax or sound-deadening spray. Instead, the metal was stamped with a series of stencil markings in yellow paint, preserved perfectly by the sealed environment. The stencil read, U.S. Naval ORD, Test Unit 0-1, Material Evaluation. Below that was a date, NOV 1969. The car wasn't just a Chrysler prototype, it was a joint venture with the Naval Ordnance Department. This explained the EXP on the VN tag and the aviation rivets. This vehicle was likely built to test the feasibility of non-magnetic ground vehicles for use in mine-sweeping operations or near-sensitive radar installations, where steel vehicles caused interference. It was a military tool disguised as a muscle car, likely driven by engineers to test the alloy's durability on public roads without drawing attention. The project must have been scrapped due to the astronomical cost of the material, and the car was supposed to be melted down to recover the valuable copper and beryllium. Instead, it had slipped through the tracks, likely sold at a surplus auction as a regular car to someone who didn't look too closely, eventually ending up with the scammer, who thought he had bought a rusty lemon. By dawn, the garage floor was covered in a mountain of red paint dust and yellow filler dust. Standing in the center was the Cuda, stripped naked. It was a breathtaking sight. It didn't look like a car anymore. It looked like a sculpture cast in solid bronze. The dark brown oxidation gave it an ancient, artifact-like appearance. The shop lights played off the curves, revealing the raw, muscular brutality of the engineering. There wasn't a speck of actual rust on it. It was indestructible. Daniel walked around this vehicle, his exhaustion replaced by a feverish excitement. He calculated the scrap value of the copper and beryllium alone. It was easily in the 6 figures, but as a historical artifact, a one-of-one military-industrial hybrid, its value was incalculable. However, the stripping process revealed one final chilling detail. On the firewall, previously hidden behind the heater box which they had removed, there was a large, lead-sealed access panel that was not on the factory blueprints. It was welded shut with a different material, something silver and shiny, nickel welding rods. It looked hasty, unlike the rest of the car's precise construction. A warning label, etched into a brass plate riveted over the weld, had been painted over with black engine paint. Daniel scraped the paint away with his thumbnail to reveal the etched text. Caution. Radiological monitoring required for interior access. The message stopped them cold. The car wasn't just a materials test. It had been used to carry or shield something. The excitement of the gold mine discovery was instantly tempered by the realization that they might have just exposed themselves to something far more dangerous than silica dust. They stepped back, looking at the lead-sealed compartment, realizing the mystery of the factory error had just evolved into a matter of national security. The atmosphere in the garage shifted instantly from the euphoria of discovery to the cold, sharp tang of fear. The warning label on the firewall, "Radiological monitoring required," transformed the bronze-colored masterpiece into a potential tomb. Daniel backed away instinctively, his breath catching in his throat, while Arthur stood his ground, his face a mask of grim calculation. The older engineer didn't panic. He processed. He knew that in the era of Cold War experimentation, the line between automotive engineering and nuclear physics was often blurred dangerously. Beryllium itself was a material closely monitored for its toxicity, but the warning suggested an active source, something far more potent than metal dust. The garage, usually a sanctuary of oil and rubber, now felt like a containment zone. They needed to know if they were standing in a cloud of invisible, ionizing death. Arthur returned to his Pelican case, digging past the XRF analyzer to the bottom layer of foam. He retrieved a device that looked like a relic from a 1950s sci-fi movie. A vintage but calibrated civil defense Geiger counter. He switched it on, and the machine let out a sharp, static crackle that made Daniel jump. Arthur held up a hand for silence, slowly sweeping the wand toward the car. The rhythmic clicking was slow, steady, and agonizing. Click, click, click. It was the sound of background radiation, nothing more. He moved closer to the firewall, the wand hovering inches from the lead-sealed panel. The tempo of the clicks didn't change. He swept the floor, the seats, the engine bay. The car was silent. The radiation that the label warned about was either contained perfectly within the lead shielding, or the source had been removed decades ago. "It's clean on the outside," Arthur announced, his voice echoing in the quiet shop. "But that panel is lead-lined for a reason. Whatever is, or was, in there, they didn't want it leaking out." "Do this!" The safety check provided a moment of relief, but it only deepened the mystery. They decided that they had to open it. The curiosity was a physical force now, pulling them toward the firewall. Daniel grabbed a fresh cutting wheel, but Arthur stopped him. Cutting into lead and unknown alloys with an abrasive wheel could generate heat and toxic vapor. They needed to go slow. They used a cold chisel and a pneumatic hammer to carefully chip away the nickel welds that held the access plate in place. It was slow, deafening work, the metal groaning under the impact. After an hour of sweating and hammering, the final weld cracked. The heavy steel plate clattered to the floor, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity recessed deep into the dashboard structure, right behind where the glove box would have been. It was lined with a dull gray material, pure lead sheeting. Sitting inside the cavity, resting on a bed of rotten rubber padding, was a heavy, cylindrical canister made of stainless steel, roughly the size of a thermos. It had no markings, only a complex locking mechanism on the top. Alongside the canister lay a thick, leather-bound logbook, its cover dry and cracking from age. Daniel reached in with gloved hands, bypassing the canister for the book. The paper offered answers, the canister offered risk. He opened the logbook on the workbench under the harsh light. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwritten entries in neat military cursive, interspersed with stamped official seals of the Naval Ordnance Test Station. The first page bore the project title, Operation Silent Runner, Prototype Unit 1. 1. Daniel began to read aloud. The car wasn't just a minesweeper testbed as they had guessed. It was something far more specific. The entries detailed a requirement for a high-speed, non-magnetic courier vehicle, capable of transporting tactical nuclear triggers and magnetic-sensitive guidance chips across active combat zones without triggering magnetic proximity mines or being detected by magnetic anomaly detectors. The Rust Scam vehicle was, in reality, a stealth nuclear courier. The bronze alloy body was designed to be invisible to magnetic sensors. The lead-lined compartment in the firewall was the transport hold for the nuclear triggers. The canister inside the cavity likely contained the dummy load used for weight distribution testing, or, God forbid, a forgotten prototype component. Daniel looked at the stainless steel cylinder with renewed wariness. Arthur carefully inspected it, noting that the seal was intact and the inert tag was stamped on the bottom, much to their relief. It was a simulator, a heavy block of tungsten meant to mimic the mass of a warhead core, but the logbook revealed something else, something that made Daniel drop the book and turn slowly toward the front of the car. The entry dated January 12th, 1970, discussed the propulsion system. It read, Standard cast iron blocks create unacceptable magnetic signature. Prototype Unit 1 fitted with experimental cast beryllium copper 426 hemi block. Heat dissipation issues noted. Severe weight penalty. Output increased to compensate. Daniel stared at the engine. In his initial disappointment with the bodywork, he hadn't touched the engine. It looked like a standard 426 Hemi, painted the iconic Hemi orange, covered in 50 years of grease, grime, and dust. He had assumed the seller had just dropped a standard crate motor into a fake body. He grabbed a rag and a can of degreaser, rushing to the front of the car. He sprayed the engine block frantically, the chemical smell filling the air. He scrubbed at the orange paint and the layers of sludge on the side of the block, near the freeze plugs. As the orange paint dissolved and the grease wiped away, the metal underneath wasn't the dark gray of cast iron. It was the same rich, brownish gold bronze as the body. He grabbed a magnet and touched it to the engine block. It fell off. He touched it to the cylinder heads. It fell off. He touched it to the intake manifold. It fell off. The entire engine, the massive, legendary 426 Hemi, was cast from solid beryllium copper. "My God," Arthur whispered, leaning over the fender. "Do you have any idea what you're looking at?" A standard cast iron Hemi block was a holy grail for collectors, worth tens of thousands. An aluminum block was rare racing tech. But a beryllium copper block? It was unheard of. It was theoretically impossible. The cost to cast an engine block out of this material in 1970 would have been equivalent to the GDP of a small country. The thermal conductivity would be insane, the engine would never overheat, but the weight was colossal. This was the only one in existence. It was a technological unicorn, a piece of engineering history that bridged the gap between muscle cars and nuclear warfare. The scam car was getting more valuable by the second. The seller had seen a car with bad paint and a rusty engine block that wouldn't hold a magnet, assuming it was some cheap, aftermarket knockoff made of pot metal. He had sold it for scrap value, thinking he was offloading a headache. Instead, he had sold the single most expensive automotive component ever manufactured by Chrysler. But the discovery brought a new problem. The logbook ended abruptly with a red stamped entry. Program terminated. Assets ordered destroyed. Crush order, Drjana 891. The car wasn't supposed to exist. It had been ordered to the crusher. Someone had saved it. The final handwritten note in the margin, scribbled in a different, hurried hand, read, "Cannot melt her down. Too beautiful." Hidden in Lot B with the surplus transport trucks. Paperwork falsified. The savior of the car had hidden it in plain sight, likely dying before he could retrieve it, leaving it to rot until it was auctioned off as generic surplus. As Daniel traced the numbers on the bronze engine block, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from the vintage car forum where he had bought the car. A private message. He opened it, expecting spam. It was from a new account, created minutes ago. The message was short, chilling, and suggested that their discovery hadn't gone unnoticed by the digital ghosts of the car's past. "I saw you bought the rust bucket from Rick. Stop stripping it. You don't know what you have. There is a secondary compartment. If you trigger it, you lose everything. Call me." Daniel froze, phone in hand. He showed the message to Arthur. The secondary compartment threat implied there was more to the car than just the nuclear transport hold. The car was a puzzle box, and they had only solved the first layer. They looked at the stripped interior, the bare bronze floor pans. Where could a secondary compartment be? Arthur pointed to the transmission tunnel. In a standard car, it's just a hump of sheet metal over the gearbox. But in this car, the tunnel was unusually wide and boxy. And unlike the rest of the floor, which was welded, the top of the transmission tunnel appeared to be bolted down from the underneath. They raised the car on the lift, the heavy bronze chassis groaning as it left the ground. Beneath the vehicle, the transmission tunnel wasn't just a cover. It was a structural spine, and there, hidden above the transmission itself, nestled in the hollow space between the gearbox and the floor, was a long, flat-sealed box, wired directly into the car's electrical harness. It wasn't a glove box stash, it was an integrated system. The wires ran from the box to a series of sensors on the rear axle and the steering column. It looked like a black box flight recorder, but far more complex. And right next to it, zip-tied to the frame rail, was a small, corroded metal tag that simply read, "Failsafe." The underside of the Cuda was a landscape of alien engineering. With the car hoisted high on the hydraulic lift, the true nature of the fail-safe device became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just a sensor. It was an executioner. Arthur, standing under the chassis with a shop light, traced the heavy gauge, shielded wiring that snaked from the black box on the transmission tunnel. One loom went to the ignition system, acting as a kill switch, but the other loom, thick and wrapped in heat-resistant braiding, ran directly to two small, ominous canisters bolted to the inner frame rails, right next to the engine mounts. Arthur recognized them immediately from his defense contracting days. Thermal incendiary charges. They were designed to burn at 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt the beryllium copper block into a useless puddle of slag, destroying the technology to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The scam car was rigged to commit suicide if someone tried to dismantle it incorrectly. Daniel stood paralyzed, the cryptic text message glowing on his phone screen. If you trigger it, you lose everything. The sender knew about the charges. This implied the car wasn't just abandoned, it was being watched, or at least its legend was known to a select few. The rust that the seller had covered up was the least of their problems. They were currently working on a live piece of ordnance. The message had likely saved the car, and possibly the garage, from a catastrophic thermal event. If Daniel had cut those wires thinking they were just old stereo cables, the voltage drop would have triggered the incendiaries. The workshop would have been reduced to ashes, and the priceless bronze Hemi would have been nothing more than a molten memory. Arthur took charge, his demeanor shifting from engineer to bomb disposal technician. He explained that these 1970s military failsafes operated on a normally closed loop. As long as a specific voltage current was running through the system, the magnets held the firing pins back. If the wire was cut, the current stopped and the pins would drop, igniting the thermite. To disarm it, they couldn't just unplug it, they had to trick it. They needed to create a bypass circuit that would feed the 12-volt signal to the charges while isolating the black box control unit. It was a delicate surgical operation on the nervous system of the car. Daniel gathered the necessary equipment, a variable power supply, alligator clips, and a precise multimeter. For the next 3 hours, the garage was a scene of excruciating tension. Every sound, a settling floorboard, the hum of the refrigerator, sounded like a gunshot. Daniel worked with steady hands, guided by Arthur's hand signals. They stripped a millimeter of insulation from the live wires without severing the copper strands, a task that required the precision of a neurosurgeon. They attached the bypass leads, sweating profusely as they dialed in the voltage to match the car's internal resistance exactly. 4 volts. Once the bypass was active, Arthur gave the nod. Daniel severed the connection to the black box. Silence. No hissing, no sparks, no blinding white light of burning thermite. The bypass held. The incendiaries were neutralized. With the threat of immediate destruction removed, they turned their attention to the secondary compartment mentioned in the text. The wiring from the failsafe box had a third branch, one they hadn't noticed at first because it was routed inside the hollow frame rail toward the rear of the car. They followed it with a borescope camera. The wires terminated not at the rear lights, but above the fuel tank. The Cuda's fuel tank looked like a standard stamped steel unit, painted black, but upon closer inspection the dimensions were wrong. It was too deep. The straps holding it were reinforced with the same bronze alloy as the body. They placed a transmission jack under the tank and began to unbolt the straps. The tank was inexplicably heavy. Even with the drain plug open and the fuel drained, it felt like it was full of concrete. As they lowered it slowly, the reason became apparent. The top third of the tank wasn't for fuel. It was a separate, sealed compartment, welded to the top of the actual fuel reservoir. The wiring from the failsafe connected to a solenoid lock on a hidden hatch located on the top side of this compartment, completely inaccessible unless the tank was dropped. The rust scam had hidden the car's composition, but the car's design had hidden its payload. The solenoid was still engaged, locked tight. Since they had bypassed the control box, they had to trigger it manually. Arthur applied direct power to the solenoid leads. A loud mechanical clunk echoed from inside the tank structure. The latch released. Daniel climbed up on a stepladder to look down at the top of the lowered tank. He pried open the heavy steel flap. The compartment inside was lined with high-density foam, now crumbling to dust. Nestled in the foam were 3 heavy rectangular cases made of dark green bakelite, a plastic common in the mid-20th century, sealed with wax and wire. They moved the cases to the workbench. They weren't very large, about the size of a briefcase each, but they were dense. The first case bore a stencil. Project Chimera. Metallurgical data. Eyes only. Why? Daniel cut the wax seal. Inside was a treasure trove of intellectual property. Microfiche films, blueprints, and handwritten formula notebooks detailing the exact smelting process, heat treatment cycles, and casting techniques for the beryllium copper alloy. This was the lost recipe. In the wrong hands in 1970, this would have been worth millions to the Soviets. Today, it was a historical goldmine, proving the car's provenance beyond a shadow of a doubt. But the second and third cases were different. They were marked ballast, Class A. In naval terms, ballast is just weight used to balance a ship. But Class A suggested something else. Daniel opened the second case. It didn't contain documents. It contained 6 heavy, dull gray metal bars, each wrapped in oil paper. He unwrapped one. It was a metal ingot, about the size of a smartphone, but incredibly heavy. It wasn't gold. It was a lustrous, silvery white metal. There were no markings on the bar itself, just a serial number. Arthur's eyes widened. He grabbed the XRF analyzer again and pressed it to the bar. The screen flashed. Platinum, PT, 99. 9% pure. Daniel stared at the bar. Platinum, In 1970, platinum was valuable, used in catalytic converters and high-end electronics, but the quantity here was staggering. The second case contained 6 bars. The third case contained another 6, 12 bars of solid bullion-grade platinum. They quickly weighed 1 kilogram, 12 kilograms of platinum. The ballast was a lie. This was a strategic stockpile. The logbook they found earlier mentioned magnetic sensitive guidance chips. Platinum was a critical component in the manufacture of high reliability contacts for those systems. It appeared the courier vehicle was fully loaded with the raw materials for a top-secret guidance system production run. When the order to scrap it came down, the savior of the car hadn't just saved the vehicle. He had saved the strategic reserve hidden in the tank, likely intending to return it or perhaps keep it as insurance. The factory error wasn't just that they made the car out of the wrong metal. The error was that the factory had lost track of a shipment of strategic assets worth a fortune, and for 50 years, that fortune had been driving around disguised as a gas tank on a rusty muscle car. The seller, Slick Rick, had sold a car for $40, $1,000 that contained over $350, $1,000 in raw platinum bullion, not to mention the millions the car itself was worth as a unique artifact. As they stared at the gleaming bars, Daniel's phone buzzed again. It was the same number. The message was longer this time. You found the ballast. Good. Now you have the leverage. But the people who ordered the car, crushed in 1970, didn't all die. The company that absorbed the defense contract is still looking for those assets. They know the car has surfaced. You have about 24 hours before they figure out where it is. You need to get the car to a secure location. I can help, but you have to trust me. I'm on my way. Daniel looked at Arthur. They were standing in a residential garage with a nuclear courier vehicle, a pile of platinum, and a potential corporate hit squad, or government recovery team, en route. The discovery had escalated from a restoration project to a high-stakes standoff. They couldn't leave the car there. It was immobile, stripped, and conspicuous. They had to make a choice, run with the platinum and leave the car, or fight to keep the history they had uncovered. Arthur looked at the bronze engine block, then at the platinum. He closed the Pelican case with a snap. We're not running, he said. We're going to finish the restoration. But first, we need to hide this. He pointed to the platinum. And then we need to welcome our guest. The garage had transformed from a place of restoration into a makeshift fortress. Daniel and Arthur moved with the frantic efficiency of men who knew the clock was ticking down to 0. The 12 kilograms of platinum bars, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, were a liability that could get them killed. Arthur, drawing on his Cold War paranoia, decided that the safest place for the bullion was not in a safe, but in the filthiest place imaginable. He grabbed an empty 5-gallon drum of used diesel oil, a sludge-filled bucket destined for the recycling center. With grim determination, he dropped the pristine million-dollar bars one by one into the black, viscous goo. They sank without a sound, disappearing into the toxic sludge. He sealed the lid and kicked the drum into the corner, nestled among piles of scrap metal and trash. To any intruder, it was just hazardous waste. To them, it was a retirement fund sitting in oil. With the assets secured, they turned their attention to the driveway. The roar of an engine cut through the night air, but it wasn't the sleek hum of a government convoy. It was the rattling, uneven idle of an old panel van. Daniel watched the security monitor, his hand gripping a heavy pry bar, while Arthur stood back in the shadows. The van pulled up to the bay door, killing its lights immediately. A man stepped out, younger than Arthur, but with the same weary, intelligent eyes of someone who had spent too much time looking at blueprints. He wore a mechanic's jumpsuit and carried a heavy rucksack. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, looking directly at the security camera. This was the mysterious Texter. Daniel hit the button to roll up the bay door just enough for the man to slip under, then slammed it shut again. The newcomer introduced himself as Elias, the grandson of the naval engineer who had originally saved the car from the crusher in 1970. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked straight to the dismantled Cuda, running his hand over the bronze fender with a look of reverence and relief. He explained that the car had been his family's burden for 3 generations. His grandfather had stolen it to prevent the destruction of the platinum, which he had discovered was being embezzled by a corrupt faction within the defense contractor, a company known today as Chimera Dynamics. The rust disguise, the Bondo and the cheap paint, had been applied by his grandfather in a frantic bid to hide the car's true nature before he died. The car had sat in a locked storage unit for decades, the rent paid automatically, until a billing error caused the unit to be auctioned off. Slick Rick, the online seller, was simply a flipper who bought the contents of the unit, saw an old car, and tried to make a quick buck without realizing he was selling a federal crime scene. Elias revealed that Chimera Dynamics had never stopped looking for the lost shipment. The missing platinum was a loose end in their corporate history that could expose decades of fraud, but worse than the theft was the technology itself. The beryllium copper casting technique used for the engine block was still classified, a lost art that the company desperately wanted to recover to secure a new generation of drone contracts. Elias pulled a tablet from his rucksack, showing a satellite overlay of the area. A recovery team, contracted by Chimera, was less than 20 miles away. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to sanitize the site. They would burn the garage to the ground to hide the evidence, just as the car was rigged to burn itself. Arthur looked at the stripped chassis of the Cuda. They couldn't drive it. It was a skeleton. They couldn't hide it. It was a massive bronze monolith. But Elias had a plan. He pointed out that the car was designed to be a stealth vehicle. Its primary function was to be invisible to magnetic anomaly detectors and radar. The team coming for them would be relying heavily on technology to locate the target mass, the specific density signature of the platinum and the copper alloy. If they could mask that signature, the car would effectively vanish from the sensors of the approaching drones. They had to turn the garage into a Faraday cage, but inverted. Instead of keeping signals out, they needed to keep the signature in. Arthur and Daniel began a frantic scramble to camouflage the car. Not visually, but electromagnetically. They grabbed rolls of chicken wire, aluminum foil, and sheets of scrap steel, draping them over the bronze body. It looked ridiculous, like a child's fort made of junk, but Arthur explained the physics. The ferrous junk would create a noisy magnetic field, scattering the sensor readings and making the ultra-pure, non-magnetic bronze beneath it look like just another pile of scrap metal. They piled old fenders, rusted hoods, and engine hoists around and on top of the Cuda, burying the multi-million-dollar prototype under a mountain of actual garbage. As they finished the camouflage, the lights in the garage flickered. The power was cut from the outside. The hum of the refrigerator died, plunging them into silence. The recovery team had arrived. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched the driveway through the crack in the bay door. 2 black SUVs, completely unmarked, rolled silently to a stop at the edge of the property. Men in tactical gear, wearing night vision goggles, spilled out. They weren't police. They moved with the precision of mercenaries. One of them held a handheld scanner, sweeping it back and forth like a metronome, pointing it toward the garage. Daniel held his breath. If the scanner picked up the massive concentration of beryllium copper or the platinum, they would storm the building immediately. The mercenary paused, adjusting the gain on his device. He swept it over the garage again. The readings must have been confusing, a chaotic mess of iron and steel from the scrap pile Arthur had built. The mercenary lowered the scanner and tapped his headset, signaling to his team. They didn't breach. Instead, they fanned out, surrounding the perimeter. They were unsure. The stealth runner was doing exactly what it was designed to do 50 years ago, hiding in plain sight, masked by the magnetic noise of the world around it. Elias whispered that this hesitation was their only advantage. The mercenaries were expecting a pristine hidden asset, not a scrapyard. They would likely send in a scout to visually confirm before committing to a destructive entry. This gave Daniel and Arthur a chance to turn the tables. They couldn't fight a paramilitary team, but they had the home field advantage, and they had the car's electrical system. Although the engine was dead, the car's immense battery bank, designed to power the magnetic stealth field generators, was still sitting on a pallet in the corner, fully charged. Elias had mentioned the car had an active denial system prototype built into the electrical harness, a feature designed to zap unauthorized personnel attempting to touch the hull. Arthur quickly rigged the battery bank to the metal door of the garage and the scattered piles of steel scrap surrounding the car. He created a massive electrified perimeter. If anyone touched the bay door or tried to climb over the scrap pile to inspect the junk, they would be hit with 400 amps of direct current. It was a crude, brutal trap, but they were out of options. They retreated to the small office at the back of the garage, locking the heavy steel door and watching the grainy feed from the battery-powered backup security camera. A shadow detached itself from the group of mercenaries and approached the side door of the garage. The scout. He picked the lock with terrifying speed and slipped inside the main workshop floor. The camera showed him moving silently through the dark, his night vision goggles glowing faint green. He swept his flashlight beam over the mountain of trash in the center of the room, unaware that beneath the rusted hoods and chicken wire lay the holy grail of muscle cars. He moved closer, reaching out a gloved hand to push aside a hanging piece of chain-link fence to get a better look at the shape underneath. Daniel watched the screen, his hand hovering over the switch Arthur had rigged. The scout's hand made contact with the electrified barrier. Daniel flipped the switch. A blinding blue arc of electricity snapped in the darkness of the garage. The scout went rigid, his muscles seizing instantly, and he was thrown back 5 feet, landing hard on the concrete. He didn't get up. The trap had worked, but the noise, the loud crack of the discharge, had alerted the team outside. The element of surprise was gone. The radio on the unconscious scout's vest crackled to life. "Team 1, report. We heard a discharge. Report." There was no answer. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Then the voice on the radio changed tone. "Clear to engage. Burn it down." Elias looked at Daniel and Arthur. "They aren't coming in," he said, his voice grim. "They're going to use incendiaries from the outside. We have maybe 2 minutes before this place becomes an oven." They were trapped in a metal box with an unconscious mercenary, a hidden fortune, and a squad of arsonists preparing to light the match. They needed a way out, and the only exit was the bay door, which was blocked by the SUVs. Arthur looked at the massive beryllium copper engine block sitting on the engine stand, separated from the car. "We can't drive the car," Arthur said, a crazy idea forming in his eyes. "But we can use the engine. It's bulletproof. Literally." He pointed to the heavy-duty engine hoist. "We're going to use the block as a battering ram." The siege began with the shattering of glass. A high-velocity canister punched through the high frosted window of the garage, skittering across the concrete floor and hissing violently. It wasn't a frag grenade, but CS gas, military-grade tear gas designed to flush targets out into the open kill zone. White smoke began to billow rapidly, filling the enclosed space with a choking, blinding fog. The mercenaries were forcing their hand, driving them out of their fortress and into the line of fire. Daniel coughed, his eyes stinging immediately, but Arthur was already moving. The old engineer grabbed the respirators hanging by the paint booth, standard equipment for a body shop, now vital survival gear. He shoved one onto Daniel's face and tossed one to Elias. They had seconds before the gas became too thick to see through. Arthur kicked the locking brake off the heavy-duty engine hoist. Suspended from the chain was the massive, stripped beryllium copper hemi-block. It was a dense, 700-pound chunk of exotic metal roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. It was their shield, their battering ram, and their only hope. Arthur signaled to the bay door. The plan was insane, but it was the only geometry that worked. The mercenaries were positioned in a semicircle around the driveway, expecting soft targets to run out coughing. They were not expecting a phalanx moving behind a bulletproof engine block. Daniel grabbed the remote for the garage door opener. He crouched behind the left side of the engine block. Elias took the right, and Arthur, the strongest of them despite his age, took the center position, pushing the hydraulic ram of the hoist. They were a tight, terrified knot of humanity huddled behind the bronze monolith. Daniel hit the button. The electric motor of the door opener whined, straining against the tension springs. The heavy steel door began to roll up, revealing the cool night air and the blinding tactical lights of the SUVs. The moment the door rose to knee height, the firing started. Suppressed gunshots thwipped into the concrete, sending chips of stone flying. As the door cleared their heads, the mercenaries adjusted their aim. A storm of lead hammered into the garage. But instead of tearing through flesh, the bullets slammed into the beryllium copper engine block. The sound was deafening, a series of heavy, ringing gongs that vibrated through the hoist and into their bones. The exotic alloy, denser and harder than steel, didn't crack. The bullets flattened against the casting, sparking wildly and ricocheting off the curved cylinder banks. The block absorbed the kinetic energy of a firing squad, serving its final unintended purpose as the ultimate armor. Pushing with adrenaline-fueled strength, they surged forward, rolling the hoist out of the garage and onto the driveway. The mercenaries, blinded by the smoke billowing out behind the group and confused by the strange metallic shape advancing on them, faltered for a split second. That was all Arthur needed. He reached into the pouch of his coveralls and pulled out one of the thermal incendiary charges they had removed from the car's fail-safe system earlier. He had rewired the detonator to a simple 9-volt battery trigger. With a grunt of exertion, Arthur lobbed the canister over the top of the engine block toward the lead SUV, which was blocking the exit. The canister arc was perfect. It landed with a heavy clatter on the hood of the black vehicle. Arthur squeezed the trigger mechanism in his hand. A blinding, white-hot light erupted from the hood of the SUV. The thermite ignited instantly, burning at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't explode. It melted. The incendiary compound ate through the steel hood, the engine block, the front axle, and the asphalt beneath it in a matter of seconds. The front of the SUV collapsed as its structural integrity was liquefied. The fuel lines ruptured, and the vehicle erupted into a secondary fireball, throwing the mercenaries into chaos. "Go! Now!" The silent command was understood. Under the cover of the blinding thermite fire and the smoke, Daniel, Arthur, and Elias abandoned the engine hoist. They sprinted toward Elias's old panel van, which was parked on the side of the garage, shielded from the direct line of fire by a pile of old tires. They dove inside, Elias scrambling into the driver's seat. The van roared to life, its engine sounding rough and agricultural compared to the tactical vehicles, but it was running. Elias threw the van into reverse, tires screeching as he backed out blindly, smashing through the neighbor's wooden fence to bypass the burning wreckage of the mercenary SUV. Bullets punched through the thin sheet metal of the van's rear doors, shattering the back window, but they were low, embedding themselves in the heavy toolboxes and the drum of scrap metal Elias had in the back. He slammed the transmission into drive and floored it, the van fishtailing wildly on the grass before gripping the pavement. They sped away into the darkness of the suburban streets, leaving behind a scene of burning wreckage and bewildered hitmen. They drove in silence for 10 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the kill zone. Elias navigated through a maze of back alleys and industrial roads, constantly checking the rearview mirror. They had escaped, but they had left the prize behind. The Cuda, the platinum in the oil drum, and the bronze engine block were still at the garage. The mercenaries would secure the site within minutes. They would find everything. Daniel felt a pit of nausea in his stomach. They had survived, but they had lost the treasure. However, Arthur began to chuckle. It was a dry, raspy sound. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out the leather-bound logbook and the 2 Bakelite cases containing the Chimera formula microfilms. They can have the metal, Arthur noted, tapping the case. Metal is just a commodity. Platinum is just money. But this is the smoking gun. He explained that while the platinum was worth millions, the documents proved a 50-year-old conspiracy of theft and treason by a defense contractor that was still operating today. The physical assets, the car and the bullion, were heavy and hard to move. The truth, however, was light, portable, and infinitely more dangerous to Chimera dynamics. Elias shook his head. Well, they won't care about the history. They'll melt the car down tonight to hide the evidence. We can't let them destroy it. That car is the only physical proof that the project existed. He was right. Documents could be claimed as forgeries, but a 4-pound car made of a material that shouldn't exist was undeniable. They needed to stop the destruction of the garage, but they couldn't go back. They needed a weapon that was faster than a bullet and more powerful than a thermite grenade. Daniel looked at his phone. The screen was cracked from the dive into the van, but it still worked. He looked at the YouTube notification from his own channel. We have an army, he realized. We just need to deploy them. He explained his plan. They didn't need the police, who could be bought or delayed by Chimera's lawyers. They needed immediate, overwhelming public scrutiny. They needed to make the garage the most watched location on Earth, instantly. They pulled the van into the parking lot of a 24-hour internet cafe, needing a high-speed connection that couldn't be traced back to their home IP addresses. Daniel plugged in the SD card from his camera, which contained the footage of the restoration, the discovery of the platinum, the rust that wasn't rust, and the final clip he had recorded just before the attack, a frantic walk-around of the bronze chassis and the logbook. He quickly edited a raw, unpolished video. The title was blunt. Urgent. They are burning this car right now. Help us. He uploaded the video to his channel, which was on the verge of hitting 10 Zoral Electra subscribers, but he didn't stop there. He posted the link to every major car forum, every conspiracy theory board, and every news tip line he could find. He included the exact GPS coordinates of the garage. He wrote a caption. A defense contractor is currently burning a stolen nuclear prototype and 350 Ks in platinum at this location to hide a crime. Police are not coming. We need witnesses. Go now. It was a digital distress flare. Within minutes, the view count began to tick upward, first in the hundreds, then the thousands. The algorithm detecting the surge in engagement and the frantic nature of the content began to push the video. Comments started pouring in. Is this real? I live 5 miles from there. I see smoke. On my way with a drone. The internet hive mind was waking up. Back at the garage, the mercenaries were regrouping. They had extinguished the fire on the driveway and were preparing to bring in a heavy transport truck to seize the Cuda and the scrap materials. They had set up a perimeter, assuming they had hours of darkness to work. They were wrong. The first sign of trouble was the buzzing sound. It sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. The mercenary commander looked up to see 3 consumer drones hovering over the property, their camera lights blinking. Then came the headlights. A lifted pickup truck with a light bar pulled up to the police tape the mercenaries had fake staged. Then another car. Then a group of teenagers on bicycles filming with phones. The flash mob Daniel had summoned was arriving. The mercenaries, trained to fight soldiers, were unprepared for a swarm of YouTubers, live streamers, and curious locals. They couldn't shoot civilians. They couldn't jam every cell phone signal. The live feeds were already broadcasting the scene globally. The secret recovery operation had turned into a viral spectacle. The commander of the hit squad realized the containment was broken. He barked an order into his radio. Abort! Too many eyes. Leave it. The black SUVs, battered and scorched, peeled away from the curb, speeding off into the night, just as the real police sirens began to wail in the distance. The crowd of onlookers pushed past the perimeter, cameras rolling, walking into the open garage where the bronze skeleton of the Cuda sat, glowing under the work lights, safe. Daniel watched the live stream on his phone in the van, tears of relief mixing with the grime on his face. They had saved the car. Now they had to finish the fight. They had the documents, and the whole world was watching. It was time to walk into the FBI field office and drop the bomb. The dawn that broke over the city was cold and gray. But for Daniel, Arthur, and Elias, it felt like the first clear morning in weeks. They sat in the sterile, soundproofed waiting room of the FBI field office. the dirty, exhausted trio looking starkly out of place against the polished government architecture. On the table before them sat the two bakelite cases containing the Chimera Dynamics microfilm and the heavy logbook. They had surrendered the location of the platinum, still safely submerged in the drum of waste oil back at the garage, to the federal agents upon arrival. The gamble of going public had paid off. The viral storm Daniel had ignited the night before had created a transparency shield so thick that no corrupt defense contractor could penetrate it. The story was everywhere. National news outlets were already running segments on the nuclear muscle car and the attempted cover-up. The government had no choice but to step in as the hero, securing the assets and launching a full-scale investigation into the legacy of the theft. The ensuing weeks were a whirlwind of legal depositions, forensic audits, and media frenzy. The Department of Justice, armed with the microfilm evidence provided by the trio, launched a probe into Chimera Dynamics. The documents didn't just prove the theft of the platinum in 1970, they unraveled a 50-year history of billing fraud, where the contractor had been charging the Navy for strategic material losses that were actually embezzled assets. The rust bucket. CUDA was the keystone that brought down a house of cards worth billions. Because Daniel and his team had brought the evidence forward voluntarily, they were treated not as suspects in possession of stolen goods, but as federal whistleblowers under the False Claims Act. This legal distinction was critical. It meant they were entitled to a percentage of the funds recovered by the government from the contractor's fines. While the lawyers fought the battle in the courtroom, Daniel returned to the garage to fight the final battle with the car itself. The garage, now under 24-hour police protection due to the high-profile nature of the evidence, became a sanctuary again. The FBI had removed the platinum and the incendiary devices, but they had released the vehicle back to Daniel. The reasoning was bureaucratic, but fortunate. The beryllium copper alloy, while expensive, was no longer considered classified technology in the modern age of carbon fiber and stealth composites. The car was legally his, a piece of surplus scrap that he had rightfully purchased. The government didn't want the headache of transporting a 4,000-pound radioactive scare prototype. They just wanted the case closed. Daniel and Arthur spent the next 18 months finishing what they had started. The restoration of the bronze CUDA required a complete rethinking of automotive aesthetics. Daniel refused to paint it. To cover the beryllium copper with paint again would be a crime against history. Instead, they focused on stabilization. They used a specialized archival wax, developed for preserving outdoor bronze statues, to seal the metal. The result was mesmerizing. The dark, chocolate-brown oxidation remained in the recesses, highlighting the rough, sand-cast texture of the manufacturing process, while the high points were polished to a warm, glowing gold. The car looked less like a vehicle and more like a mythological chariot pulled from the sea. They rebuilt the engine, the massive bronze hemi-block requiring custom-machined internals to handle the thermal expansion rates of the copper alloy. When they finally fired it up, the sound was unique. The density of the bronze block absorbed the high-frequency mechanical noise, leaving only a deep subterranean thrum that could be felt in the chest more than heard. It was the silent runner coming back to life. They installed clear polycarbonate floorboards in the interior so that the factory error, the bronze chassis itself, was always visible. The lead-lined compartment in the firewall was preserved as a historical feature, a chilling reminder of the car's original deadly purpose. The unveiling of the finished car was not held at a local car show, but at the National Museum of American History. The crowd was massive. The rust scam story had become a modern legend in the automotive world. Standing next to the gleaming golden-brown beast, Daniel looked at the plaque the museum curators had installed. It read, "The Chimera Prototype, 1970, the vehicle that didn't exist." It detailed the story of the scam, the hidden platinum, and the three men who refused to let history be crushed. The financial resolution arrived a week after the unveiling. The Justice Department settled with Chimera Dynamics for a staggering sum to avoid a protracted public trial. Under the whistleblower statutes, the payout to the team was substantial. The reward for the recovery of the strategic platinum, combined with the percentage of the fraud settlement, totaled just over $8. $4 million. It was a life-altering fortune. Elias used his share to start a nonprofit dedicated to preserving industrial history, clearing his grandfather's conscience. Arthur finally retired for real, buying a small island property where he could fish and tinker without worrying about radioactive isotopes. Daniel, however, didn't buy an island. He bought a larger workshop. The money allowed him to stop flipping cars for survival and start hunting for the impossible machines that history had forgotten. He kept the bronze CUDA, loaning it to museums around the world, but every now and then he would take it out on the road. Driving the heavy, golden beast down the highway, he would think about the online listing that started it all. He thought about the seller, Slick Rick, who had seen a flaw and sold a fortune. He realized that the greatest skill in restoration wasn't welding or painting. It was the ability to look at something broken, ugly, and rejected, and see the masterpiece hiding underneath. The rust had been a lie, but the journey was the truest thing he had ever known. And that is the incredible, true story of how a scam turned into a national treasure hunt. It just goes to show that sometimes the things people try to hide are the very things that change the world. If you enjoyed this wild ride through history, chemistry, and high-stakes mechanics, please do us a massive favor. We are working hard to bring you more uncovering stories like this. Click that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you never miss a find, and leave a comment below. What's the biggest hidden treasure you've ever found in a piece of junk? We read every single comment. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next Garage Find.